Hello, and welcome back to our study of the Gospel of Mark. During this unit, we're looking at the remarkable journey continues, specifically Mark chapters 4 through 7. I want to remind you, of course, of the previous lesson a few years ago that we did on video with Mark 1 through 3. There, the unit was entitled The Remarkable Journey Begins, subtitled Faith and Hope. I'll put a link to that playlist in the end screen as well as in the description if you're watching via Facebook instead of YouTube. What we're looking at is the life of Jesus and how the gospel is being presented by Jesus, the gospel of the kingdom. The subtitle of this unit is the gospel of urgency, and that reflects not only Jesus' urgency in preaching the gospel, also Mark's presentation of the ministry and life of Jesus in such a way as to give that sense of urgency. And along the way, we've also seen how many of the people who have approached Jesus have done so with a sense of urgency as well. We'll see not so much urgency in this text as there is a reflection upon reception of Jesus and his presentation of the gospel. If you have your Bibles, you want to open them up to Mark chapter 6, verses 1 to 6. Quick note, full disclosure, when I concluded last lesson, I indicated that the verse references for this unit or for this lesson would be Mark chapter 6, verses 1 to 7. That's just an oversight. I fixed that, and you can see that that's corrected here. We are looking at Mark chapter 6, 1 through 6. One of the things I want to point out is that Mark and Matthew parallel one another very closely at this point. If you look at Matthew chapter 13, verses 53 to 58, with the exception of a couple of words here and there, they're exactly the same. I'll point some of those out as we go through the lesson. Luke has an account of Jesus speaking in Nazareth in the synagogue as well. There, it's presented much early in the life of Jesus. And we're also told what he quotes from and how he responds to that and what the response is to that. There is a similar quote here in this text that we find in Matthew, Mark, and Luke about the same time or with reference to the same kind of event. Questions are whether what's going on in Luke is the exact same event as we see here in Matthew and Mark. To dive a little bit deeper in the moment of our introduction, it's interesting in the reference Bibles many times where there are parallels given, the reference Bibles will show those parallels in the text, or at least in a footnote somewhere. The NIV that I read on a regular basis as a reference Bible, and it shows that directly Matthew 13, verses 52 to 58 are parallel to Mark chapter 6, verses 1 to 6, but doesn't show Luke 4 as a parallel. So that's kind of interesting to think about. So there is a little bit of an issue of what do we do with Luke in relationship to Matthew, Mark, and this event. Is this the same event or not? It could be that there have been other times when Jesus went to Nazareth. It's just that Luke puts it in a different place. Again, Luke tends to be a lot more chronological than the others, though Mark is very chronological as well. It's just that Mark and Matthew have this event taking place really about the midway point of Jesus' ministry. Not quite midway point, but he certainly do have it after he's gone around and ministered around the Galilee for quite a time. John, for his part, doesn't have a reference to Jesus in Nazareth at that point, other than to say, as he's making his way from Judea back into Galilee, in chapter 4, verse 44, John will put in an explanatory note how Jesus had indicated that a man is, or a prophet is without honor nowhere except in his own hometown, or John's gospel says, in his own country. We are going to talk about that quote as we go through this text here, because Jesus puts his own approach or gives his own application to this in terms of his situation as we look at that. I don't want to get too far afield in that. I just want you to be aware of that. So at times I'll make a parallel to Matthew. Along the way, I'll bring out a couple of other relationships between all four gospels at this point. And clearly there is something going on in microcosm in this passage that really is reflected upon not only in the other parts of the three synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but John has a summary statement in which, or of which, this is a microcosm as well. A lot of illusory language here about what's going to be part of our discussion. I just want to prepare you for that. If you have your Bibles, open them up to Mark chapter 6, verses 1 to 6. I'll read that in a moment. First, I want to go ahead and go over the outline with you. I know it's only 6 verses long, but I do believe that there is a way to kind of put this in perspective. And so as we look at the text, again, the title is No Place Like Home. We're going to see the irony of that in a moment. First part, we're going to look at the narrative of Mark and how he tells us the transition from one place to another. And I'm just going to call this Going Home. Chapter 6, verse 1. And then what we're going to see over the next few verses, first in chapter 6, verses 2 to 3, Jesus' reception by his hometown. That's going to be followed up with verses 4 through 6a, and there's a reason for breaking that up at that point. You'll see as we go forward. Jesus' reaction to his hometown. So a little bit of alliteration there. Try to keep it something memorable. And then lastly, a narrative summary again, leaving home in verse 6b. Well, let me go ahead and read that passage to you. And as I read that passage to you, I just want to remind you that I'm reading from the New American Standard Bible, the 2020 edition. There are a couple of things worded very well here in the NASB that some of your translations won't point out. They may be a little bit less literal, if you will. The 2020 edition of the NASB is word for word in many places, but they've kind of cleaned up the language, made it a little bit more readable. And as a result, it kind of fits in that category, not quite dynamic, but certainly not as word for word as maybe its predecessor in the 95 or the 77 edition. It's a lot of talk about translation, but I want to point out to you that I also read the New International Version, and the New International Version is going to word things a little bit differently that I think miss a point here that I will make in the text because of what we know from the original and how the New American Standard brings it out. Again, looking ahead, but pay attention as we go through. I'll make some connections between the beginning part of this passage and the ending part of this passage. I know that you're reading using another translation. It may be the ESV or the CSB. It could be the KJV, any number of translations out there, and you can compare and contrast how it's worded in your text with what we're doing. As always, I try to make a kind of reflection upon what's going on in the original as it's needed, as it will be helpful. There is a place or two here as well that will do that. As we go through the text and as I read, you follow along in your text, and then we'll come back and talk about this verse by verse and phrase by phrase. Mark says this about the ministry of Jesus. Jesus went out from there and came into his hometown, and his disciples followed him. And when the Sabbath came, he began to teach in the synagogue, and the many listeners were astonished, saying, "Where did this man learn these things? And what is this wisdom that has been given to him? And such miracles as these performed by his hands? Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary, and brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? And are his sisters not here with us?" And they all took offense at him. Jesus said to them, "A prophet is not dishonored except in his hometown and among his own relatives and in his own household." And he could not do any miracle there except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and healed them. And he was amazed at their unbelief. And he was going around the villages teaching. Well, let's go ahead and take a look at this text. It's interesting that Mark is very helpful here in giving us narration of Jesus' movement from place to place. It's not incidental, of course. We do know that Jesus moved around a lot. We've already detailed in previous lessons his going back and forth different sides of the Sea of Galilee. What we're seeing here is likely him leaving the area of Capernaum. When it says that he went out from there, we recall that Jesus had just been in that region of the northwest part of the Sea of Galilee along that shore, maybe around Capernaum. It's where he had healed the woman who had the hemorrhage of blood, as well as raising Jairus's daughter from the dead. So when it says he went from there, it's that area. So he goes westward, maybe slightly a little bit southwestward, and he comes to his own hometown. Now, already in the introduction, I mentioned the city of Nazareth. It's important to note that while it's not stated as such here in the Gospel of Mark as Nazareth, it's defined as his hometown. So what I want to do is at least demonstrate to you through the obvious reading of parts of Scripture you already know, pointing out that this is Nazareth. Luke and others specifically mention Nazareth. Here, Mark doesn't say it. He just calls it his own hometown. So how do we know this is his hometown? How do we understand this, that it's Nazareth? Well, again, while it's not mentioned by name here, when you look at Mark chapter 1, verse 9, for instance, and there are other places throughout, Jesus is referred to as Jesus of Nazareth. So that's a given. Now, as you read the Bible, of course, there are times when information is given that it's just understood. Later on, in other places, there may be explanation. I'm giving you a little bit of both here. Mark does refer to Jesus as Jesus of Nazareth, and he's referred to that by that in a number of other places, as we'll point out. But there are also places in Scripture that justify calling him that is very specific to that. Mark chapter 1, verse 24, for instance, Jesus is referred to as Jesus of Nazareth by demons. We see later in Jesus' ministry, as he's making his way to Jerusalem prior to his arrest and trial and crucifixion, the blind man in Jericho, blind Bartimaeus, calls him he calls him Jesus of Nazareth, son of David, in chapter 10, verse 47. That's just in Mark. But we do know that there is historical reason to recognize Jesus as coming from Nazareth. We have here, for instance, Mary and Joseph. Before they're married, they're betrothed. They are in Nazareth, where Joseph is from. I'll give you those references in a moment. Certain things happen there before they end up going down to Bethlehem. And while he does go to Bethlehem to be born, because he's raised in Nazareth, Jesus is called Jesus of Nazareth. So, for instance, in Luke chapter 1, verse 26, we're told about Mary being in Nazareth at the time when Gabriel appears to him. For his part, Matthew will tell us about the place of Nazareth in a moment. We'll get to that in a moment. I jumped ahead. Joseph, in chapter 2, verse 4 of Luke, travels from Nazareth to Bethlehem to be recorded for the census. They return then after the birth of Jesus. There is the 8-day period. After 8 days, Jesus goes to Jerusalem with his parents, obviously, and he is circumcised and he is named. It says in verse 39, chapter 2, verse 39, that they return to their own city of Nazareth. So it's clearly that's where they're from. Subsequent to that, we know that they will be back in Bethlehem at some point as we harmonize Matthew and Luke here. The Magi appear in Matthew chapter 2. They stop in Jerusalem, find out where the Messiah is, where this king that they're looking for is. They are told that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem, so they go to Bethlehem. Herod wants to go, of course, not to worship Jesus as he says, but ultimately later to kill him. When the Magi return a different way, they don't talk to Herod. He gets mad. He goes to Bethlehem and he has the little boys 2 and under killed. Before that, though, Joseph is warned in a dream by an angel to take Jesus and his mother Mary, or Mary and their son Joseph, and Jesus, I'll get it out now, down to Egypt. After Herod dies, it says that they returned back to Bethlehem, but because there were relatives of Herod still alive and the danger persisted, they went all the way back up to Nazareth where they settled. It's very clear that they were from Nazareth. One couple more places here. They went back after the incident in the temple as well. So in Luke chapter 4, we're told that Jesus is with his parents in the temple for a feast. They go down there all the time. That was their practice. At the age of 12, he's in the temple. Mary and Joseph leave with their caravan. They realize Jesus isn't with them. They go back and find him. And when they see him, of course, they're astonished that they see him. You want to go back and look at chapter 4 there. But when they pick him up and take him home, it says that they returned where he had been brought up. They went back to Nazareth where they had been brought up. I want to set all of that up because as we see Jesus not just being born, because he wasn't born in Nazareth, he was born in Bethlehem. He was raised in Nazareth, and that's a lot of background because it sets up the response of the people here. As we'll see later, they are going to judge Jesus based on who they remember him to be, and they compare who he was to what they see now, and it has an adverse effect on them, certainly an opposite effect than what we would have expected, and we'll talk about that moving forward. All of this is to say that when Jesus goes back to his hometown, he's no stranger to the people. They are familiar with him. They're familiar with his family. They're familiar with his occupation. They're familiar with who he was as he was growing up. Now, that's not a negative thing. It's just a reference to what they understood him to be as he was growing up. And that's going to make it difficult for them to really gather up who he is as they witness him before them in this moment. Well, as typical, we also see this. Jesus' disciples go with him. It's important to note that these are the 12 at this point, not a larger group of people. We do know that when Jesus went from place to place, particularly going from one side of the Galilee to the other on boat, there was a time when he took not only the 12 disciples with him, but others. But here it's very clear that this is his disciples, not just disciples. This is his disciples. And we won't go into a long discussion of how the phrase his disciples is a reference just to the 12. We do know later in verse 10 in the next lesson we'll look at, they are referenced as the 12. But there is more discussion that could be had related to the phrase of his disciples, your disciples, and so forth. And I detail that in the premium commentary I wrote for this lesson. You can see a link to that in the description if you're interested in purchasing that. Much of what I'm doing here comes from that, although not verbatim. I've pared this down so as to fit for our lesson specifically on video. But I want you to note that this is a place where Jesus takes his disciples, the 12 disciples. But again, pointing out the way Mark tells us this narrative, very vivid, very detailed, and times maybe giving us information that you don't think is necessary, but is very, very helpful. He went from there, entered into his hometown Nazareth, and his disciples accompanied him. Well, what happens when he gets there? Well, we've read in chapter 6, verses 2 to 3. I'll read those verses again as we go through them to detail them. He's there for some time. Now, we don't know how long. I would venture to say because of the reference to Sabbath, he's there less than a week before this event takes place. It could have been the day before, it could have been a couple days before. We just know that it's not been an extended period of time. It just says this in verse 3 or verse 2. And when the Sabbath came, he began to teach in the synagogue. And the many listeners were astonished. I want to stop there. There's still more of verse 2 there, but I want to point out a couple of things. Sabbath, as we've already mentioned the time frame. He's there on Sabbath. This is Jesus' pattern. We know this from Luke, even chapter 4, when he goes to the synagogue in Nazareth. He is described as having done this on a regular basis. It was his pattern to go to synagogue on the Sabbath. Also, while Luke talks more in detail about what Jesus read in that event, whether or not it's the same event as here, Luke gives us more detail about what Jesus read from the text and sat down to talk about. Here, Mark only says he began to teach in the synagogue. We don't know what he read. We don't know what he said. We only know that he taught. Now, a side note, which is not really a side note because it bears as background for why the people respond to Jesus the way they do. Jesus did not have, quote, the rabbinic training. What was the process by which a gentleman could get up and read and teach in the synagogue. We know that he does this. He's known as teacher and rabbi in many places in the Gospels, but he gets up and teaches in the synagogue. This is a place of worship. It is a place of education. It is a community center in many ways. It required that there be at least 10 Jewish men before there can be a synagogue. Jesus wouldn't go to the temple all the time because that was just in Jerusalem, but he did go on a regular basis. Here, the synagogue was that place where the people could meet together, worship, learn and study the scriptures, and be community to one another. This was a common activity by Jesus. So what Mark details for us here is not unusual. What becomes unusual is what follows, and that is the reflection of the people listening to him as he is teaching. So he goes in and he begins teaching. So it means that it's worded in such a way as to indicate that he was teaching, for an extended period of time, perhaps, in this particular event. The many listeners were astonished. Now, a couple of things about that. One of the things we detailed in previous lessons is that Jesus was gaining large crowds. Now, I don't know how large the synagogue would have been. It probably could have held about 100, 150 people in it, but many is the word that is used there to describe the population, if you will, of those in the synagogue. The other thing is that as they are listening, Mark tells us they were astonished. Now, as we look at that word astonished, many times it's a word that is used in a very positive way. Here, it seems at first to be positive, but as we read the rest of the text, as they reflect on certain things in their understanding of who Jesus is and was, that turns around into a little bit of a negative thing. The word astonished comes from a word that means literally a strike or a blow, almost like someone's hit you. Now, of course, it's being used metaphorically here. Here, we might say that they were struck with astonishment. Some of your translations are going to say amazed, and the reason that may be problematic is that later on the word amazed is used in the NASB. That's a different word than is used here. It's a different word altogether. That's a more common word we'll see when Jesus responds with amazement. Here the word is a little bit different, but again, there are positive uses of this word. So let me give you some examples of the positive use of this word. In Matthew chapter 7, verse 28, the end of the Sermon on the Mount, it says that the people were astonished. They were amazed at him because he taught, but one with authority. Matthew 13:54, which is parallel to this passage, uses the same word to describe the response of the people. They were astonished. They were amazed. Then in other places in Matthew chapter 19, verse 25, you'll see a reference to the astonishment of the disciples. Chapter 22, verse 33, the crowds after they hear Jesus teaching, and specifically his response to the Sadducees regarding resurrection and marriage, when Jesus basically puts them in their place of misunderstanding Scripture and not recognizing the power of God. The response of the people to Jesus basically putting those Sadducees in their place is that they were astonished. They were amazed. This is a positive thing. This is a positive way of seeing it. In Mark chapter 1, verse 22, again, Jesus has been teaching. Here again, there's an amazement, there's an astonishment because Jesus was teaching, and not just teaching, but with authority. Later, after this particular passage, in chapter 7, verse 37, there is a reference to astonishment and amazement to Jesus as he does miracles. And in chapter 11, verse 18, there's the crowd in amazement at Jesus after he cleansed the temple. We do see this also in Luke. Luke chapter 4, verse 32 references amazement after Jesus' teaching, particularly close around the part where Jesus is speaking from the scroll of Isaiah chapter 61 in Nazareth. There's an amazement there. Later on in Luke chapter 9, verse 43, after he delivers a demon-possessed person, there is amazement among the people. And then one outside the Gospels, this isn't all references to the use of the word for amazement or astonishment that I'm giving you, but certain ones that are reflective of both the negative and positive. Acts 13:12, as Paul and Barnabas are making their way through Cyprus, they come across Sergius Paulus, who is a leader on the island. He reacts with amazement at the teaching about the Lord. And we see that as a positive. Now, we can see a positive use. It's interesting that there is a certain sense of amazement and astonishment of the parents of Jesus when, as we previously mentioned, in Luke chapter 2, and I think earlier I said Luke chapter 4 in the temple, Luke chapter 2 in the temple, particularly chapter 2, verse 48, when they find Jesus in the temple, they're amazed. It's interesting that it's not a positive amazement. They're like, wow, he's really here in the temple. Isn't that wonderful? No, they found him and he wasn't with them, and that's why they were amazed. It appears that there are many times then that this word is used in a positive way. Here it may be transitioning from just an astonishment, awareness, and amazement, but as they reflect again, as we said, on who he is and who they remember him to be, the crowd then is going to be offended at him, as we'll see. The amazement of Jesus' hometown stems from what we'll call a comparison contrast of what they see in him now versus what they remember him to be. Notice what they're going to do. First, they're going to reflect upon what he's been doing, and then they're going to reflect upon who he was and how they know him and what they might recall of him and how he's recognized among the people in the town with regard to the family that he has. This is not unlike some of us. We might go back home and haven't been there for a while. We're maybe different, but people still think about who we are. Interesting one. This is kind of innocuous. It's kind of humorous. There are people from Delaware, where I was originally born and lived for the first several years of my life, who still call me Joey. Now, my wife likes to call me that in an affectionate moment, in a sweet moment. But there are people today who will still call me that. I have some cousins and some friends that do that. So it doesn't matter that I'm as old as I am now. They still think of me that 5, 6, 7-year-old named Joey. In another way, though, there may be reflection upon who you are and who I am. When we go back and share the gospel, there may be some kind of amazement at what we've become. Now, I'm kind of venturing off, although I'm sticking to what I want to say, venturing off a little bit and making these applications to later on reflect upon how we're going to be responded or how people are going to receive us when we share the gospel because of who they think we are. My point, though, is that many times there may be a lack of acceptance because what they remember of us is a negative thing, and they can't believe the change that's taken place. Um, or just because you were young and didn't, have your full maturity yet, now that they see you mature, it's hard for them to grasp that. There was nothing negative that the people remembered about Jesus. We know he was sinless. He never sinned. He was a good kid. Obviously, we see that, while it wasn't seen as a point of rebellion, his parents understood that he was in the way they understood him when he stayed back in the temple. They didn't see that as a positive. Clearly, though, Jesus reminded them that he was to be about his father's business. But we're looking at a group of people who have seen Jesus grow up, and they've seen him there, as we'll see, up until almost 30 years old. As Luke will tell us, Jesus begins his ministry at about the age of 30, and now Jesus has come back. This may be a year or so after the ministry has begun, and now he's coming back with a different approach, or he's coming back obviously on mission from what he was when he was living in Nazareth. All of that to say that, and not to excuse it, but to help recognize that what these people are doing is they're seeing Jesus before their eyes. They are going to recall things that they have seen and heard about Jesus doing in the present, but then they backtrack and think, well, this is this guy from back then. And they can't wrap their heads around that. So we often have kind of a negative response to us when we go back, but for different reasons. I know of other people who have had difficulty, quote, going home to share the gospel with family because what they used to be. And the family has a hard time believing that. They still think that, you're going to fall back, you're going to return to your old ways. This idea of following Jesus is just a fad. For Jesus, they think of him as one thing. They're amazed and astonished at what they're hearing, but they still can't get out of their minds the Jesus that, quote, they grew up with. Here was a man who, as we'll see in a moment, held a trade that didn't require mental skill necessarily. They required craftsmanship and physical skill and obviously artistic skill, but nothing in what they see Jesus doing as they demonstrate their amazement at his teaching. So we'll talk about that in a moment as we go forward as well. They're amazed, they're astonished. At first, that might be a good thing, and it maybe is. But here's what happened. They got caught up in reflection. What you're going to see, and I'm going to divide it out for you as you look at the rest of chapter 6, verse 2 and into verse 3. There are basically 7 questions, 7 points of reflection that the people have regarding Jesus. And as they go through that, you see then ultimately that leads to their offense at him. So we'll look at this. We're going to break it up into 3 parts. There are 3 questions related to what they've seen him doing, what they've heard him say. 1 question basically is a bridge question related to what they knew of him before this in terms of his occupation. And then 3 questions related to when reflecting upon who he's related to in the city. So let's go ahead and take a look at these. So the first 3 questions are these. Where did this man learn these things? What is the wisdom that has been given to him? And such miracles as these performed by his hands. Well, in summary, then, ultimately they are looking at what they've witnessed of him. They've just heard him teach, and we don't know what he's been teaching. We don't know what he's been saying. Again, maybe there's something parallel to what Luke records for us. He would get up, read from the scroll, and interpret it. We know that in Luke, they were offended because Jesus took a text from Isaiah 61 about coming Messiah and applied it to himself. And at first they were positive until he mentions the Gentiles, and then they want to throw him off the cliff in Nazareth where he escapes. Certainly there is an amazement that turns into offense there. Here, we at least get a sense of questioning. Where did this man get these things? They'll ask that. We'll see in question 4 why they would ask such a question. But clearly, as they've seen Jesus grow up, he was doing one thing, and now he comes back with all of this, quote, learning. Wisdom alongside of that. What is this wisdom that has been given him? Now, 2 things or 3 things about that. 1, it's given to him, so they're assuming that he didn't just have it. It had to have been given to him. Then also, the idea of the wisdom itself, that he is speaking wise things, but there may be undercurrent to this idea of interpreting. Are they trying to understand what he's saying? What is this thing he's talking about? What is this wisdom that's been given to him? It's almost parallel to what we see earlier in the gospel, where Jesus explains that he speaks in parables so as to reveal the hardened heart of those who would not accept the gospel. To the disciples and others who are seeking God, they would be able to understand the parables, but the parables have as a means to expose the hardness of heart. We'll come back to that idea here as we look at the passage. But they're asking, what is this wisdom? They're not only not understanding it, we're going to see that they're not going to accept it. One thing else they have to acknowledge, though, is that he has performed miracles. What is this wisdom that's been given to him? And thirdly, what is such miracles as these performed by his hands? These deeds of power. We'll come back to that term when we look at the rest of the text here. And Jesus' response to them, these deeds of power, these miraculous deeds performed by his hands. That's key for us, as we'll see not only in this text, but in reflecting upon previous texts. Jesus actually did things by hand. Now, again, we don't know what he did in Nazareth prior to this. We do know what what Mark tells us about Jesus' activity after this event. But clearly, they have seen him doing miracles. They have heard about him. His reputation has preceded him in many ways as they hear about the hometown boy. Now they come back and they hear him firsthand. They know about the miracles that he's done. And again, he's done them by his hand. Real quick, jump ahead before coming back. Recall in the previous chapter the miracle of Jesus taking out the legion from the demon-possessed man, his healing the woman with the hemorrhage, and then raising Lazarus' daughter, or raising Jairus' daughter from the dead. Each of them involves some kind of touch, laying on of hands. We'll see that coming up here in this text as well. They don't know where this is coming from. This is the Jesus that we know he grew up here, but where's he getting this? And they ask that because they know him. And the way they know him is that they recall his occupation. Where is this learning coming from? What is this wisdom that's been given to him? How is he doing these miracles performed by his hands? Isn't this the carpenter? Notice how they're trying to piece together what they're seeing of Jesus here with what they know of Jesus before. He was a carpenter. Now, the word carpenter is really a translation of the word tekton, which means craftsman. It doesn't have to be limited to wood alone, but certainly they see in him someone who worked with his hands. Certainly, it would take measurement, it would take skill, it would take wisdom, if you will. Even the Old Testament talks about wisdom in craftsmanship. Who knows what he had made, what they had seen him build. He probably worked in Cyprus, a few miles away with his father until his father passed away. He is the carpenter. They know that. The question being asked affirms the answer already. Is this not the carpenter? I think the NASB does a good job of doing that. What we would do to make sure and very clear that it's a question we're expecting a yes answer, we would say, this is the carpenter, isn't it? Again, they're looking at Jesus from who he was and trying to wrap their minds around how he's now talking. This is something that comes out from him that they don't expect. Is this not the carpenter? Now, here's one place where Matthew diverges a little bit. Whoever wrote first, they're different. Matthew's version says the carpenter's son. You might think that's a discrepancy, but it's really not. Here's the deal. Yes, Joseph, Jesus' earthly father, was a carpenter, and Jesus followed that. And that would have been typical in that time for the son to follow the occupation of the father. Here, Mark just references that he's the carpenter. If Joseph was a carpenter, clearly Jesus was. They saw Jesus do that work. Here, they don't think, in at least Mark's presentation, there's not a reference to Joseph as such. I mean, it doesn't have to be, but there's still that correlation there. Ultimately, the key is they know that he was a man who had skill, but they weren't expecting this to come out of his mouth. He worked with his hands, but they weren't expecting to see someone who could use his hands to heal people. Again, notice what they're doing. There's a kind of a disconnect. I don't want to use the word cognitive dissonance because I don't want to use it the wrong way, but I think it applies here. They're looking at this man that they saw grow up. This is the carpenter. How is it that he knows these things? Where's this wisdom coming from? How it's been given to him? How is he performing these things? This is Jesus, the carpenter. This doesn't make sense. Well, now that they've mentioned his occupation, the crowd that is there then reflects upon more about Jesus' identity. Three questions related to his family. Is this not the son of Mary? Clearly, it is. That's what they're affirming. This is Mary, and she's probably in the room. Um, then they mention the brothers. Is he not the brother of James, Joseph, or many of your translations will say Joseph, Judas, and Simon? And then lastly, it says, are not his sisters here with us? Well, a couple of things to note here. One, notice as they reflect upon Jesus' identity, they reflect upon Jesus' identity as he is related to the others. He's the son of Mary. He's the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon. And then lastly, his sisters are mentioned. They're looking at him. They know who he is, what he's done, where he's come from. His family is among the group. They are still living in Nazareth. They know him. This is the hometown boy, so to speak. But they're not wrapping their heads around this. Now, a couple of things to note here. One, we know about the four brothers and their names. We know James and Judas later as those who wrote the letter of James and the letter of Jude. We don't hear anything really more about Joseph and Simon at all in the New Testament. A little bit about the sisters. Here we know that it's plural. We don't know how many sisters. Another place where Matthew gives us information that Mark doesn't, with one little word. Matthew says, are not all his sisters here with us? And that word all, in my estimation, would have implied more than two. If we were just two, we could say both. They could use all if there are only two and they're there. But maybe there were more than two. And then lastly, just because it's part of our discussion, I would say that brothers and sisters means brothers and sisters, that these are the children of Mary and Joseph after Jesus. That's not the major point here. The major point here is that the people in Nazareth are looking at Jesus in the context of his being this carpenter, being among the people that they see. They know who he grew up with. They know where he's come from. They're having a hard time accepting what he's been able to do here, and they then will take offense at him. It's important to recognize that they are still looking at Jesus from, quote, a human standpoint. They're looking at Jesus in a similar way that Paul references in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 16, where he says, we no longer consider Jesus from a human point of view. In other words, literally according to the flesh or by the flesh. He says we don't do that anymore. Well, clearly the only context that the people of Nazareth has was, well, we know him, quote, according to flesh. They're not using that language, but their response to him is such. They're thinking about only as this boy who grew up. And notice, they take offense at him. They don't have the sense or the compassion or the sympathy, if you will, or the open heart to see a man who has left them, who was once a carpenter, coming back with this wisdom, with this teaching, with this power to heal. They don't see him as hometown boy done good. It's not like he's gone off to college and come back, and they can see how successful he's been. They don't receive him that way at all. They take offense at him. They're having a hard time accepting the fact that this young man that they watch grow up, though he didn't do anything wrong, and he's just a guy, now he's come back with this. Their hearts lead them then to be offended by this. Questions about his ability to do what he's doing, reflection upon who he was in terms of his occupation, countering his ability to do those things and speak in that way, and clearly reducing him then to merely the son of Mary, the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon, and the older brother of some sisters. They took offense at him. It's interesting that they are offended. They see us as a scandal. They can't, as I said many times already, wrap their heads around this. There's no way for them to accept this. In some way, what you're seeing here then, in one small way, because it is played out in a number of different places throughout the ministry of Jesus, something that we see in Isaiah 53, verse 3, that chapter that deals with what we have in a kind of prophetic way of reflecting upon the life of Jesus. Isaiah 52:13 through 53:12. Go back and read the whole thing, but in verse 3 it says this: he was despised and abandoned by men, a man of great pain and familiar with sickness, and like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we had no regard for him. Interesting there that the prophetic word there includes the person speaking. So it's not just them who did not regard him. Here we see, while this is going to play out in other aspects of Jesus' ministry among the religious leaders, among some of the Jews, among others, we see it acutely here among the people of Nazareth. They despised him. You will see that kind of response later, as we said, ultimately leading to Jesus being crucified. John would later report something like this. In John chapter 1, verse 11, we're going to come back to that here in a moment. He came unto that which was his own, and his own did not receive him. Jesus is going to say a word here about that rejection in a moment, but this is summarizing what really happened in the ministry of Jesus. There are those who rejected him. John is going to go on and talk about the blessing for those who do receive him and believe in him. But at this moment, in reflecting in general about those who reject him, we see that rejection taking place, as I said, in an acute way in the city of Nazareth. He's been successful, quote, to say, in terms of followers growing, the miracles he's performing, the kingdom being preached. But here, it's almost like the message falls on deaf ears. He'd come to his own, and his own did not receive him. There's going to be a reflection by Jesus here and a response in his actions as well. First, in verses 4 through 6a, we see Jesus' reaction to his hometown. It says in verse 4, Jesus said to them, a prophet is not dishonored except in his own, or in his hometown, and among his own relatives, and in his own household. Let's talk a moment about that. This is not something Jesus made up. This was a general maxim of the day. You probably, as we've already talked about, have experienced this your own self. People having a hard time seeing what you've done and what you've become because of what they know you used to be. That's clearly emphasized and not exaggerated, but emphasized, and becomes even stronger here with regard to Jesus and who they remember him to be, and now what they see in him. When they are offended at him, Jesus speaks out a word that he kind of modifies to this particular instance. He says, a prophet is not dishonored except. Many translations are going to say a prophet is not without honor except. But the point is, he's received everywhere else. He's acclaimed everywhere else except home. It says this 3 ways: his hometown, among his own relatives, and in his own household. Now, the word own there before relatives and household in the New American Standard is supplied by italics, but it's implied by the context. So not just among relatives, but his relatives, not just his own household, or not just his household or household, but his household and his own household. 3 levels there. We'll talk about that in a moment. The response then, and the result is, he could not do any miracle there except that he laid hands on a few sick people and healed them. He was amazed at their unbelief. Well, let's talk about this a moment. We've already hinted at this in some way. The maxim of not receiving honor at home is something that he speaks specifically to his situation, but now he modifies it to include phrases like hometown, relatives, and household. We've already expressed that. When you look at Matthew's version of this in Matthew 13, verse 57, later on in Luke chapter 4, verse 24, and then John 4, 44, and I'll want to come back to that in a moment. We see here that it's not worded exactly the same way, but the intent is the same. There is rejection by his own hometown people. His own country, John 4 will say here in a moment. What they all have in common, though, whether the wording is slightly varied in each, here's what's going on. It highlights their unbelief in Jesus, their lack of belief. The word is literally unbelief. He's just stating that with regard to their reaction to him. They do not accept him. They do not honor him. Their unbelief leads to their lack of honor. They don't respect him. They've only looked at him as what he was. They can't appreciate him for who he is. Side note, he's always been that. He's always been the Son of God. He's always known, even though he's grown in wisdom and stature and favor with God and man. The point is, his status before God has never changed. He's always had this. And his wisdom has been noted even from the time of childhood, age 12 in the temple, as the priests were reflecting upon his great wisdom with the kinds of questions he would ask. So it's there. The people of Nazareth just aren't letting it click. They're not letting it sit with them. He's come to his own people. Notice in Mark chapter 3, verse 21, Jesus is teaching, and there are people that come to him, and it says in verse 21, and when his own people heard about this, they came to take custody of him, for they were saying, he has lost his senses. Now, from time to time, I look at that text and think that may be his own family. We don't know for sure. It just says his own people. I'm leaning toward that being his own family, uh, only because of what we know John says about Jesus' brothers here in another text. There are certain questions that Mary has about who Jesus is, even though she knew, she didn't know all of it. Here, there's an attempt to come to get Jesus out of the crowd because they think he's lost his senses. On another occasion, shortly after this, in Mark chapter 3, also verse 33, it says that Jesus' mother and brothers came for him. And we see the parallels there in Matthew 12:48 and in Luke 8:21. Again, a sense of who is Jesus? What's going on here? They're going after him. Now, one occasion it seems that they're going after him because they're concerned about his safety more than anything, it appears. But here's something that we need to look at. When he talks about his hometown, his own relatives, and his own household, we see in John chapter 7, verses 2 through 5, it's time for a festival, and the brothers are going down, and they see Jesus, and they say, look, if you are who you say you are, you need to make this public. Anyone who claims to be Messiah needs to make it public. Jesus says, any time is good for you, but it's not my time yet. I'm not going. Now, he eventually goes, but here's the point that John brings in for us to explain the problem that the brothers have with Jesus. They're challenging him. They're not believers. And he even says his brothers did not believe in him. Unfortunately, we know they do come to believe in him. The resurrection changes everything. We see in the upper room after the ascension of Jesus, Jesus' mother is there and his brothers are there, and we can assume his sisters were there. We can assume that they all actually came to believe who Jesus really was. But in the meantime, in this time, in his earthly ministry, they did not believe in him. Again, we come back to John chapter 1, verse 11, which is summarizing all that took place in Jesus' ministry. Some acceptance and some rejection. Here in Nazareth, he came to that which was his own, and his own did not receive him. As a side note, we know the rest of the verse in chapter 1, verse 12, but those who did receive him, Jesus, God was welcoming them as children of God. So there's that promise of the gospel there. Well, what was the impact of their rejection of him? Well, in verse 5, Jesus could not do many miracles. It says that he couldn't do any miracles except lay his hands on a few people. Now, Matthew's version simply says he could only do a few. He could, or it says it this way, he couldn't do many miracles. Still saying the same thing. The point, there's some kind of limitation. They did not have faith. They lacked belief. And it says that Jesus was amazed at their unbelief. That's more than just having difficulty believing. They had an attitude of unbelief. There was a rejection of Jesus, no faith in Jesus. Well, I think it's important for us to talk about this briefly. What role does faith have in Jesus' ability to do miracles? It's kind of up in the air because we know in the previous texts, when Jesus heals the woman who has the hemorrhage, he tells her her faith has saved her, her faith has healed her. We do know of Jairus, the synagogue ruler, who comes to Jesus in faith because he knows that Jesus can do something. He is then told to believe more that his daughter would rise, and she did. We know, though, there are times when he's done something that didn't seem to be a response to faith. So, for instance, in John chapter 5, the man who's been crippled for 38 years at the pool of Bethesda, Jesus comes to him as he sees him. He says, do you want to be well? And the man's response is simply, how can I get well? Whenever the waters are stirred, someone gets in before me. He doesn't answer the question. Jesus heals him. And later on, when people question him for breaking the Sabbath by carrying his mat, he doesn't even refer to Jesus in a positive way. He just says, the man Jesus who healed me told me to carry my mat. Basically throws him under the bus, if you will. He doesn't seem to have much faith. What role does faith have? Well, we have to take the text seriously here. It says that he wasn't able to do many miracles except to lay his hands on a few people and heal them. So let me bring this down for you a little bit. I know this is a touchy situation. What role does faith have in Jesus' ability to do miracles? But very clearly here, it says he was not able to do any miracles except lay hands on a few people and heal them. He was amazed at their unbelief. Let me put this in perspective for you. The word for was not able is the word that comes with the word of not having the power to. It's the word dunamai, which means I am able to or I can. The noun that is used here for miracle is the word dunamis, a deed of power. There's a word play going on in here that doesn't come out in English unless we try and not manipulate it, but at least help you see. Let me see if I can do this. He didn't have the power to perform a deed of power. Let me reword that. He had no power to perform a deed of power. Now, again, that's kind of pushing back a little bit against our understanding of who Jesus is and was. We know he was all powerful, but there was this occasion in his hometown where Matthew and Mark indicate his inability to do miracles. You might want to water that down a little bit and say, well, he just wasn't willing to because of their unbelief. Maybe, but that word dunamai, not able to, has to do with the ability or the power to do something. I'm just going to leave it at that. I want us to stew over that a little bit and really reflect upon how much their unbelief impacted Jesus' response to them. He had no power to perform a deed of power except lay his hands on a few people and heal them. Interestingly enough, as we said, that laying on of hands is important. Earlier, the people reflected upon how he was able to do miracles by laying hands on people. Here, he does lay hands on a few people and heals them. He doesn't have to lay hands on people to heal them. He didn't do that with the man in the pool of Bethesda. There are other places where he doesn't have to do anything to heal. He healed the centurion's son in John chapter 4 by speaking the word from a distance. So he doesn't have to, but it's very vivid, very tactile, if you will, to lay hands on and heal. I want you to key in on that phrase. He was amazed at their unbelief. Now, that word amazed there is from the word thaumazo, which means I always tell my Greek students the way I remember thaumazo is the word wow. They were amazed. They were in awe. Think about that. Jesus in awe of their unbelief. He was struck, though that's not the word that's used here. Like the word earlier when they were astonished, the word struck. He was amazed negatively at their unbelief. Can you imagine Jesus there in his own hometown? As we'll see in a moment, he'll leave, but he's reflecting upon his experience with his hometown, and he can just be shaking his head in bewilderment at their unbelief. Jesus was amazed in the negative sense of their unbelief. Well, Mark then concludes by telling us what Jesus went on to do. We can reflect on what could have been had they been more accepting and believing in Jesus, but they don't. Let me stop down before I move on to that transitional narrative statement and make this correlation as we've done in previous lesson. Earlier, we talked about Jesus' ability to heal was a foretaste of what his ability to save was. So, and the words used for salvation and save and deliverance are the same for both physical deliverance and for spiritual deliverance. We see that in the woman with the hemorrhage. She was saved physically, but that's a prelude to her being saved by faith spiritually. We see the same thing with the raising of the girl, Jairus' daughter. Jesus raises her from the dead, but that's prelude to his ability to raise us from the dead in our own salvation as well. And delivering the demon-possessed man. Each of these things that Jesus does in the physical are basically a picture of his ability in the spiritual. So what correlation do we have here? Many people, the majority of people appears to be in Nazareth, were not able to believe Jesus and who he was. That limited his ability to heal, which perhaps also demonstrated their not being saved. Their lack of faith in him to heal ultimately will result in their lack of faith in him to save. I want you to see that correlation. Jesus' miracles aren't done for the sake of doing miracles. They are a sign of who he was and what he can do even beyond that. Think about that for a moment. When Jesus walks away amazed at their unbelief, there is a sense in which that unbelief means not just their unbelief regarding the message of the healing, but that message of the kingdom as well. We see similar then in what we have in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 6, where the writer there says, without faith, it is impossible to please God. That's a difficult thing for us to grasp, how faith impacted Jesus' ability to heal. We have to take the text at face value. And we do have this maxim from Hebrews chapter 11, without faith, it is impossible to please God. And just a quick shout out to James 2:26. What does faith do? It results in works. It results in activity, and they did not exercise that. Jesus' amazement. You know, that amazement's countered by Luke chapter 7, verse 1 through 10, when Jesus is confronted by a centurion and he has faith. Jesus looks at the man and his faith and says, not even in Israel have I found such great faith. I can't help but to imagine Jesus reflecting upon not only the ministry that he has been doing throughout the Galilee and Israel and Judea and Samaria and so forth throughout much of his ministry. By the time he gets to say this, there's got to be some part of it that reflects upon home and in Nazareth. Not even in Israel have I not found such great faith. He could say he's found great unbelief, but he's not seen that kind of faith. Notice the contrast there. The centurion was a Gentile. Well, Mark then quickly concludes, he was going around the villages teaching. So he leaves Nazareth and starts going around the villages. Now, don't want to belabor this point because of a little phrase here, but it's interesting. Ultimately, what Jesus does, he goes back on the circuit. It literally says he was going around in a circle the villages. He was going to the villages in a circle. The word kuklo there, we get our word cycle from that. He went on circuit among the villages. He didn't stay in Nazareth. He went back out on the road to the various villages. And the word for going around is literally the word for going around. Doesn't necessarily mean in a circle until you see the word circle. He went on circuit again. And Jesus did what Jesus does. He went on teaching. So he made the circuit around the villages. The NIV says from village to village. And as he went, he taught. That's what he came to do. And what we're going to see then as we go forward is that along the way, as he's going from village to village, he is going to commission his disciples to go about sharing the gospel as well. Real quickly, let's have a conclusion, a reflection. It's disappointing to see Jesus rejected, isn't it? We wouldn't think in our minds that someone would reject Jesus, but they did. How could they not see who Jesus was? Well, they were blinded, obviously, in his own hometown, among his own relatives, in his own household. Now, that would change later with the resurrection among many, but clearly they did reject him. We could ask why they were not persuaded by what they had seen him do and heard him teach, instead of judging him on the basis of what they knew he was when he was growing up. Let me rephrase that. As we've said before, they couldn't get past who Jesus was when they heard him teach and saw his miracles. They weren't persuaded more by what, quote, current Jesus was to get beyond what he was growing up. Again, he wasn't a bad kid. He was a good kid. He was a hard worker, but they're not seeing his ability to teach and do miracles from what they recalled him doing as a young person. Another thing to think about, and this might be something you can do as you go through the Gospels in general, and we're going to bring this up in a few more places as we go through the lessons. Remember the parable of the sower and the soils we looked at in chapter 4. And Jesus talked about the 4 different kinds of soils and responses to the gospel. The sower speaks the word, and there are different responses. You can think, for instance, what kind of soil was the people in Nazareth? We don't want to generalize because there were some who believed, but in general, there was lack of belief. Go from place to place. Review each encounter that Jesus has with different people and different groups of people. And we can almost use that parable as a way to characterize and filter the different responses. And I identify the different responses of Jesus in these different ways. What kind of soil was Nazareth? What kind of soil are you going to encounter when you go and preach the gospel, when you share the gospel with somebody? And the reason I bring that up is I'm making a transition from the end of this lesson into the next lesson, because what's taking place in this lesson, while we don't have a direct correlation because we're not Jesus, Jesus does respond to rejection. And what we're going to see in the next lesson is Jesus is going to send out his disciples and he's going to prepare them for rejection as well. That parable of the sower and the soils needs to be top of mind when we go out and preach the gospel. Here, Jesus encountered a rocky soil, a non-receptive soil. There are people today and will be who reject the gospel. You've probably preached and shared the gospel with people who have rejected it. It's a reflection of the soil. It's not a reflection of you as the sower. Um, you just need to know that you keep going and recognize the different soils that you're going to encounter. We'll see more of that, more of a direct application for us as we look at what Jesus has to say to the disciples as they go on mission. But I do think we need to see here, even Jesus was rejected. He came unto his own, and his own did not receive him. Thanks be to God that those who did receive him, he gave them the right to be called children of God. As you're watching, I pray that you will receive Jesus. I pray that if you have been in a mode of rejecting Jesus, you will look at him more in terms of who he is as the Son of God, the miracles he did, the teaching he provided, and not as simply the carpenter. He's not just a man. As C.S. Lewis said, if you think of him as just as a man, he's just a liar or a lunatic, or he is Lord. Another way some people would characterize it today, when they doubt that the Gospels even give us accurate information about Jesus, they would say he was a legend in the negative sense. Lewis says that Jesus doesn't give us that option. To think of Jesus simply as a good man, well, that's to think of Jesus as the people of Nazareth did. They couldn't get beyond him being a good man to seeing him as the Son of God. They left him as a good man, but someone not capable of doing the things that he was doing and saying. They took offense at him. When we really study about who Jesus is, some are going to be offended. Many are going to be offended. I just pray that you will not be one of those who is offended, that you will truly see Jesus for who he is, as the Lord, as the Messiah, as the Savior. As we conclude, I want to pray real quickly, and then we'll have a quick reference to next week's lesson. Let's pray. Father, I thank you for this word. I thank you for Jesus. I know that he was rejected, and I lament that he was rejected by his own people. Thank you for the promise that comes to all who receive. And I just pray right now, if there's anyone watching who has not received you, that they would take to heart who Jesus was, truly as the Son of God, preaching the kingdom, being the Savior, and doing miracles as evidence of his ability to save, and they will accept him. For those that preach the gospel, I pray that you will continue to give them strength and courage. Pray that they will recognize the various soils that they encounter when they spread the gospel. And I just pray, Father, that you will help us to be wise in the way we respond to those who receive and reject the gospel. Help us to honor you in all that we do. I do pray that you will guide and direct us in all that we do and say. We want to bless your name right now. Be glorified in us today. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, real quickly, I know we've already talked about it. Let me go ahead and give you a quick preview of what we're going to look at next lesson. Lesson 9, we're going to look at a titled Shake Off the Dust, Mark chapter 6, verses 7 through 13. And what we're going to see there, of course, is Jesus taking his disciples and putting them out on mission and preparing them for what may be rejection. Now, they're going to come back later with words of success, but what do they do if they are rejected? And this has been a long lesson, probably more than you think we could get out of 6 verses, but I hope that you have reflected upon who Jesus is, because the Gospel of Mark, as with all 4 Gospels, is to tell us who Jesus is, and help us to reflect upon the way Jesus is received and not received. Help us to be those who receive him. Help us, Lord, to be among those who help others to receive Jesus and not reject him. Well, until our next lesson, I pray that the Lord will bless you and keep you. I pray that he will make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. I pray that he will lift up his face to you and give you peace.